Hello, my name is Rick Bullis, and this is a video presented by Solano Community College on outcome assessments and how to make them interesting and productive. It was written by Gene Thomas and myself. So let's get started. First of all, you should know that this video is presented in 5 different parts. The first part is what are outcome assessments? The second part is why do we assess our courses? The third section is how can we assess our outcomes? Finally, followed by the fourth section, which is examples of assessments. And finally, at the very end, we will talk to you about how to submit and complete these assessments. So let's start off with what assessments are. Now, in a nutshell, you can say that an assessment is a knowledge or skill that you want your students to learn. What you're doing is assessing, are they actually learning it? So we have a whole list of examples right here. In a math class, for instance, you would want them to learn how to solve a particular type of math problem. Or in English, you'd want them to display proper grammar. Or in stagecraft class, you'd want them to learn how to paint theatrical scenery. In aeronautics, you'd want them to repair airplane engines. And finally, as another example, you would want your students to, in biology, identify and describe cell structure. So, let's talk a little bit more about these outcomes. First of all, they were written by disciplined faculty just like you, and they can be adapted for your own class needs. And this is a very important point. You can adjust these outcomes slightly to match what you would like to assess in your course. So they're required to be listed in your syllabus, so they are very prevalent all over the place. And later on in this video, we'll show you how to find the assessment outcomes for all of the classes taught at Solano College. Also, just so you know, they're required for our teaching load, and they're written down in our collective bargaining agreements. So now we've moved on to section 2, why we assess outcomes. So ask yourself, why do we do it? Do we do it because we have to? Do we do it because it's in our contract? Do we do it because it's required for accreditation? Well, yes, and there are other reasons as well. We do it because, frankly, it helps improve instruction. It also helps you prove that you're doing your job. For instance, you can prove and document that, yes, I did indeed teach my students this important skill set or base of knowledge or something like that. It also has a very interesting effect where it helps you to reflect on how you're instructing your classes, which in my mind is a very valuable tool indeed. It also helps us keep our syllabi and our lessons plans current because we're continually thinking about new ways that we can assess these outcomes. And finally, it helps refocus the students to more objective-based goals. And it really frequently does provide them with the tools they need to know that they have accomplished a goal. So, we do it all the time anyway. So why not do it in a way that's not just instructive to our students, but is also instructive to us? For instance, we, as teachers, assess our classes constantly. We're always wondering, how can I make this subject more interesting? We're also wondering, are the students really understanding this topic? Or perhaps, maybe, is the textbook working? For me, I don't know about the rest of you, but frequently I find myself dissatisfied with textbooks because they don't discuss an issue or something like that the way I wish the textbook would. So I find myself frequently changing textbooks. I also wonder sometimes, why do my students always fail on these questions on the exam? Well, that's something that you might want to assess. And finally, we always ask ourselves, how will I grade my students? Will it be a project? Will it be an essay? Will it be a multiple choice exam? So as teachers, we frequently ask ourselves these assessment-oriented questions already. So where can these outcomes be found? It's very important, once you know that you need to assess these outcomes, where you can find them. Well, they're easy to find. They're on the Solano webpage. You just type in www.solano.edu, click on the SLO tab at the bottom, and then Course Outcomes, Criteria/Methods, and then finally find the course on the long PDF that's many, many pages long, scroll through it until you find the class that you are teaching. So now that we've talked about what assessments are and why we assess, now it's time to get to the nitty-gritty and actually talk about how to conduct these assessments. So first of all, obviously you need to find your outcome assessments, and we just showed you how to do that. Next, we need you to develop an instrument or a measurement, and then conduct the assessment. Finally, you'll need to interpret the results and then plan for some improvement. More simply, what you want to do is state your claim, provide evidence for the claim, and then draw conclusions about your claim. This is brought to us by George Olgan. So please do yourself a favor. Make sure to integrate pre-existing exams, essays, projects, or any other work that's conducted by students, and then integrate that and adapt it so that it fits into your assessment measurements and instruments. Alter them to provide an appropriate measurement for the outcome. That's very important. Make sure that you are testing exactly what it is that you want to be testing. So let me first talk about a couple of common problems. Frequently, we've noticed in curriculum committee and assessment committee that sometimes faculty members confuse grading with assessments. A grade is a student's overall performance in the class. An assessment is a much more specific analysis of whether or not the students have actually integrated this knowledge or skill. So it doesn't provide as much insight or as much focus. So here's an example. Let's give example number 1. 15% of the students in this class earned an A, 20% earned a B, 30% earned C's, and the rest of the students received D's or F's. Well, that provides a grade for the students, but it does not provide us examples of knowledge, such as this doesn't show that nursing students have learned how to calculate dosage for a particular medicine. It also doesn't show that the students have learned how to cite sources on a research paper. Let's move on now to a common problem number 2. Please don't confuse instrument with methods or methods with assessment. So, in other words, providing a list of methods, such as providing a list of quizzes that were given, or exams, or group projects, those are simply the ways to assess knowledge or skills. You need to describe how students performed on a quiz, exam, or project. So, in other words, let me rephrase this. An instrument is a tool used to collect the data. A method is how you collect the data. But an assessment is the process of collecting, synthesizing, and interpreting this information. Now, we've already talked about what instruments are because faculty members use them all the time. They include things like exams, essays, demonstrations, projects, laboratory demonstrations, and surveys. But I would like to talk for just a little bit of time about different forms of methods. Now, this is an opportunity for faculty members to get a little bit more creative. What you can utilize is a whole range of different ways to create this outcome assessment. So you can utilize your own observation, you could utilize a rubric, you could utilize a survey, you could survey your students using a scale of 1 to 10, otherwise known as a Likert scale. You could have an actual physical demonstration of skill, or you could use focus groups or plain and simple objective grading. Now, here's a really good example brought to us by the automotive program here at Solano College. The instructor plain and simply takes mailboxes and hammers them and puts a dent in them. And then he says, okay gang, I've taught you everything you need to know, remove those dents. And then he probably uses a rubric to evaluate the students on how good they are at removing the dents. So now it's time to provide you with several examples of assessments. Let's take example number 1, for instance. This is from Photography 70. So let's read this real fast. The objective is to demonstrate comprehension of the technical components of digital cameras and Adobe Photoshop to effectively photograph and utilize digital enhancements with visual literacy. This was developed by Ron Zach. So when we look at this rubric, we can see that they've created a very interesting matrix which talks about several different categories, including conceptual literacy, visual impact, spatial configuration, etc. And then there are references to how the levels of acceptability that the students have achieved. So as you can see in this rubric, it has some very interesting expectations for the students. Notice that there are 4 different columns, including exemplary, emerging, competent, and pedestrian, which creates a nice sliding scale between the best possible outcome for students all the way down to where perhaps the student lacks cohesiveness or concept or ideas or things like that. This provides not just the student but also the faculty member with a very interesting range of assessments rather than just simply a yes or no or a black and white answer. Now for our example number 2 is from a favorite of mine, an acting class. The SLO for this is students will demonstrate basic skills of acting, including physical, vocal, imaginative, analytical, and emotional elements. This is resolved fairly easily by a simple rubric. All I do when I'm grading my students is I evaluate their body language, their movement, their imagination, their realism and emotion, and all the other categories, and I rate them whether or not they were below expectation, at expectation, or if they exceeded expectation. And when I gather all this information up, I then can not only test it initially, but I can also compare results from beginning of the semester to the end of the semester to see how well they've improved. Now let's take an example from a different school, from Anthropology 110. Explain the interconnectedness of the economic, political, and socio-cultural forces of globalization amongst diverse cultural groups. Really? This is a huge outcome. If any of my students actually were capable of explaining this, I think they would deserve a Nobel Prize. Quite honestly, a topic like this is probably the equivalent of 3 or 4 doctoral dissertations. So what you would want to do, because this assessment is so huge, you'd want to break it up or adjust it in a way that would allow you to assess individual elements. Let's look at our 4th example, which is a great SLO. Explain the processes that shape the Earth and how they change over geologic time. Now, I personally love geology, and I think that this would be a perfect assessment model for maybe doing some sort of student presentation or a group project. Imagine if you assign different students different elements, like you take wind erosion, you take volcanism, you're in charge of plate tectonics, and you handle water erosion, or such examples like that. And then you could develop a rubric to assess each different category of different types of elements and forces that shape the Earth. Well, now that we've provided you with a few examples of assessments, I'd like to provide you with a couple of extra hints. First of all, we'd like you to, if you can, to avoid relying upon only one form of assessment. In other words, semester after semester of relying upon multiple choice exams, for example. Variation in methodologies frequently produce a richer set of data. So there's another hint that we've got here for you. Remember that it's all right if your results are not what you expected, right? Sometimes they don't meet your criteria for success, but remember that perfection in these assessments is not expected. Continuous improvement is the goal. So if you don't meet your goals, what you can then talk about in your assessment is what steps you will take to help improve this element of your SLO. So, finally, in the end, the most important element is that regulators and administrators want to see you plan for how you assess and how the instruction can improve. In the end, it boils down to planning a better class semester after semester. One of the new trends that the state of California is encouraging us to engage in is the idea of common assessments. Now, what does that mean? Well, by March 1st, 2015, courses with multiple sections and instructors should use the same or a similar assessment method and rubric to score students' performance. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, that means if you teach psychology and you have 8 other peers that are also teaching the same psychology class, you should collaborate with each other to develop a common assessment in all of those sections of courses that are taught. Now, let's look at the math example for a common assessment that's already been developed. So let's take this assessment, common assessment example from Math 4. First of all, you'll notice that there is a note to instructors to help them conduct this assessment. Then they go through a whole series of ideas. First of all, they list success criteria. The idea that a student receives a rating of proficient or outstanding on the question means that they would consider that student to have been successful. Now, what they are testing is this SLO, which is they want students to demonstrate the ability to use functions as a mathematical tool to model the conceptual ideas of algebra and trigonometry. So they also have selected a question type. What they want all of the math faculty to utilize is to find and simplify a difference quotient. They provide examples, but faculty members can use whatever formula they want, so long as it is a difference quotient, and then they assess it using this grading rubric. They rank students based upon whether they are outstanding, proficient, substandard, or poor. And this will create a wonderful, rich mine of data for their assessment across all Math 4 courses. So there's also a second SLO that is tested in this Math 4 Common Assessment. In this SLO, they want students to solve application problems involving trigonometric functions and graphs. So first of all, they identified the question type. So it's important that the question type remains the same, but there's a little bit of latitude in here. It's a trigonometry application problem where students must determine an unknown side of a right triangle given an angle and one side. So they provide an example, but of course faculty members can choose a different word problem should they choose. And then once again, they apply a rubric which establishes whether the student is outstanding, proficient, substandard, or poor. So now we're in the final stretch, talking about section 5, which is how to complete and submit the individual assessment form. You can find the form by clicking on the SLO tab on the home page, and then finding the individual assessment form. All you have to do is insert the SLO that you are assessing, then find the success criteria, which are identified already for you, then tabulate the results, and finally, start discussing and analyzing some planned action to help improve the class. So, next steps are relatively simple. Once you complete the assessment form, you then need to submit it to your school coordinator, but please make sure to do this electronically. Finally, just so you know, adjuncts get paid for up to 7 hours of work for them conducting assessments. And you don't have to conduct or complete any paperwork in order for that to take place. And you will get paid as soon as the assessments are uploaded into the database. Just so you know, we've adapted a common assessment rubric for us to assess the quality of these assessments. So just so you know, we are looking at your assessments to see if you've assessed your classes in a substantial way, including some depth and breadth to these. So remember that quality assessment is quite important. So please ask yourself while you're conducting these assessments, do these assessments really truly have some depth and breadth to them? So now finally, if you have any questions, make sure to contact your school coordinator. They're listed right here. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact Jean Thomas or myself. So, thank you for listening. We've covered a lot of material in a short amount of time. If you have any questions, once again, contact your school coordinator. Thank you.